Spinoza and Bergson, through and beyond Deleuze. Freedom as undissociated joy. Abstract. Two related problems of incompatibility and compatibility, are addressed to understand Deleuze's philosophical project and to deepen our understanding of his use of Spinoza and Bergson, that of the compatible and incompatible features of Spinozism and Bergsonism on the one hand, and on the other hand, the status of metaphysical compatibilism with respect to freedom in all three of their philosophies. I trace the incompatibilities and insist on the value of reopening the problem partially covered up by Deleuze's creative engagement. Spinoza and Bergson remain incompatible despite Deleuze's mixture, and metaphysically, Bergson and Deleuze explicitly affirm the coexistence of incompatible ingredients as constitutive of our very existence and freedom. Some version of metaphysical incompatibilism is affirmed by all three. Life, consciousness, and freedom force us to think an irreducible incompatibility as constitutive, the coexistence of necessity and freedom on the one hand, and a movement beyond teleology and mechanism on the other. Deleuze's radical pluralism rejects the value of reconciliation and instead deploys an expanding multiplicity of incompatibilities. I flag certain parallels and resonances between Spinoza and Bergson that are not common Deleuzian themes and suggest that Jean-Marie Goyot provides a stable link to Bergsonism through his spiritualist Spinozism. Despite Bergson's criticisms of Spinoza, they share a moral notion of freedom expressed in intellectual generosity, which I characterize as undissociated joy. Can you mix a philosopher of the eternal with a philosopher of the temporary? There are many divergences and resonances between two of Deleuze's greatest influences. Most noteworthy of all is a resonance without resemblance between Bergson's view of freedom as emerging from contingent moments of hesitation in consciousness, and Spinoza's freedom as a free necessity of intelligence acting from its own nature. Intensity and affectivity are central to each of these philosophers, and their views of freedom depend on descriptions of an operative psychological cause by which humans improve their minds and their understanding of life, what Spinoza calls the formal reality of an idea, and what Bergson calls intuition, and which he links to virtuality of pure memory and is explained through dissociation. Both understand freedom through what we today call attunement, the psychophysiological patterning that orchestrates psychical life in various activities that are rooted in and yet also hindered by the sensory motor system of the living body. Attunement, which encapsulates attention, mood, relevance filtering, winnows and focuses experience, dissociating from what is deemed irrelevant or lacks valence, canalizing and foregrounding the appearance of affordances. Both reject the typical state of the mind, the attunement of the average human, its epistemological and cognitive structure built on chance encounters, forming a merely practical knowledge that is superficial, attuned to utility, and which is unphilosophical because it is distracted or dissociated from the true causes. And finally, both use the views of freedom to promote an ethics of generosity, mutual aid, and empowerment through a collective effort to understand and philosophize. That is, to promote undissociated joy. And yet it appears that Spinoza's philosophy marches towards eternal rest and tranquility in the unchanging power of God, the infinite intellect, an absolute positive necessitarianism. Bergson rather went for duration and becoming, rejected absolute determinism in favor of an indeterminacy and contingency found in the living duration of effort and creativity. Both appear to dissociate from one of philosophy's perennial extremes, the eternal and the temporary. By reopening consideration of several incompatibilities between Bergson and Spinoza, my goal is neither to argue for or against the viability of a Deleuzian synthesis or to engage directly with Deleuze's interpretation of them. I suspect any direct comparison of them by Deleuze in text or lecture would exhibit a profound sense of certain incompatibilities and disagreements between his two teachers, even though the only such instance I could find displays no such caution in Philosophies of Thought. Lecture 7, January 20th, 1981. He was not accustomed to overgeneralizing similarities between historical thinkers, and yet his extensions of each of his inspirations beyond their particular horizon has no doubt proven to be philosophically rich. My aim is to evoke the value of further scholarly reflection on the topics themselves, which has both contemporary and historical relevance, through and beyond Deleuze framing. There are many parallels between Spinoza and Bergson's views of movement, intuition, their critiques of Descartes and teleology, that we will carefully examine below. Above all, they were both committed to harmonizing science and metaphysics, knowledge and morality, and to do so by diagnosing the sources and remedies to political and social dysfunction in relation to our affective life. These undeniable resonances that Deleuze exploits center on their different, but in some ways complementary views of intensity and affectivity. Even though, according to Actas, Deleuze is not entirely faithful to Spinoza's view of affects. Some will object to calling Spinoza a compatibilist, rather than a strict determinist or necessitarian, even though Spinoza reduces all causes to the modality of necessity and openly rebuked and dismantled Descartes' indeterminate free will, and even though Bergson and others have misread him as a mechanistic determinist. The truth is that Spinoza did think freedom and free causality were real and even achievable by humans, and that we need to consider the modalities of possibility and contingency in order to get there. In fact, all three of these philosophers can be considered metaphysical compatibilists, insofar as metaphysical compatibilism consists in preserving aspects of both libertarian freedom and naturalistic necessity. They fit together the modal incompatibilities by offering alternative forms of causality based in what could be called organismic compatibilism. Bergson rejected what he took as Spinoza's failed compatibilism for its strict parallelism, and put forward a new model of compatibilism based in perpendicularity. As we will see, the perpendicularity affirms an irreducible incompatibility between not only epistemic vectors, science and metaphysics, but ontological levels, actual and virtual, becoming and being. Above all, a compatibilism worth anything must be one that faces and attempts to handle the incompatibilities endemic to the concepts of natural necessity and supernatural freedom, not merely ignoring or repressing one or the other. There are many forms of compatibilism from the history of philosophy which are by no means for that fact compatible with each other. They often tend to be either more idealistic or more materialistic, organic or mechanical, empirical or phenomenological, or for affirming or rejecting representational models. There are also incompatibilities between the various ideas of a single compatibilist thinker taken on their own. If we manage to be careful readers of any particular philosopher, we will find incompatible vantage points and conclusions across their corpus. There are many Spinozas, diverse and incongruent vantage points within his work, that of modes and substance, or of duration and eternity. Similar difficulties accompany squaring the different claims of the theological political treatise with the ethics, or even between the elements of proof and the scholia, and the appendices of the ethics itself, especially the contrasting tone between the appendix of Part 1 compared to the preface to Part 4. A Spinoza who rejects the finite and transient to one who devotes all his care and effort to developing the mind within the realm of ignorance so as to escape it. There is a Spinoza who radically rejects teleology, freedom, and religion, and a Spinoza who accepts these concepts by his own framing as the activity of conatus, free necessity, and intellectual generosity. Deleuze himself refers to Spinoza the atheist, while others say the religiosity of Part 5 is either a ruse or a blunder, as Jonathan Bennett famously called it, dangerous rubbish. Others, like De la Rocca and Carlyle, have defended the coherence of his work. It is my contention that the many Spinozas cannot consist of an actual unity forming a static concept of a whole system, but is rather a movement that harbors potentialities in the dynamic and transformative event of thinking. There is a thought that emerges from traversing incompatible vantage points that even if it does not resolve the tension, it brings about a new and much needed set of insights in contemporary philosophical thinking. Whatever each of us might think of Spinoza's philosophy, our various allegiances or refusals, our inspirations taken or recoils away from him, we can hardly deny the fecundity of his writing to produce a reaction, or even to transform the minds of readers, both for and against him. Above all, philosophers like Hegel or Deleuze appear to gain a sense of license from Spinoza, as if reading him made them certain of their purpose, what they must achieve in philosophy. His philosophy has perhaps one of the most varied dispersions of reactions and interpretations, philosophically, spiritually, aesthetically, and politically. As Bergson said of the Élan Vital, just so, the force of Spinoza's thought itself is a vis a tergo, a force from behind, which explodes like a firework out in diverging directions through dissociation. The elan of life, according to Bergson, tends both towards its own increase and enrichment in animality and intuitive metaphysics, or in its diminishment and insensitivity in plant life and static logical modes of thought. A personality is not a simple identity or empty subject. Rather, its actuality is exceeded by virtuality that together form an intensive multiplicity implicating divergent tendencies, the path closed off in life as much as those taken. There is a multiple unity of the person, which permits vast changes of horizon by which diverging personae would actualize our individuations in different ways that closes off certain tendencies of the embryonic whole of the personality. The invention of the self is accomplished by a dissociation and repression of parts of the self that distract it from its commitments. The various commitments of Spinoza resist a simple dissociation. his affirmation of the body, of the reality of organism and life, or his leveraging of infinity and geometrical ideas, each of his themes can and has been lifted and put to work in unique directions, disengaged from their context. They have sprawled materialisms, idealisms, intellectualisms, physicalisms, and spiritualisms. Spinoza's philosophy has produced a multiplicity of incompatible schools, has been interpreted in vastly different ways at different times. When Deleuze reads, "We don't know what a body can do," he opens the avenue of becoming for new concepts in materialism. He also appears to leave behind certain spiritualist commitments that Bergson rehabilitated. Claire Carlyle reads Spinoza as a tender and gentle-minded philosopher who exhibits the virtues he praised: piety, generosity, and caution. These virtues express true religion, all that we desire and do to promote the empowerment of all people by fostering collective virtue building. Here, another spiritualist reading of Spinozism emerges, not unlike the French spiritualist Jean-Marie Guyot, or certain themes found in the German Romantics. Carlyle pushes back against several Deleuzian themes, especially his insistence on an absolute immanence in Spinoza. Following Geber Baroche, both his wider interpretive strategy and in seeing the materialist reading as a fashionable overstatement that winds up missing the point Spinoza was actually making in this scholium. The scholia are generally more polemic and thus tend to exaggerate things to make a move methodologically. While Spinoza sounds Nietzschean in a rebuke reminiscent of the despisers of the body, unlike Nietzsche, Spinoza certainly would not have written sentences such as, "But the awakened, the knowing one says, 'Body I am, through and through, and nothing besides. The soul is just a word for something on the body.'" There is more to Spinoza than materialism or atheism. He was no despiser of the soul, and perhaps, even after Bergson and Deleuze, today we still don't yet know what Spinoza can do in metaphysics and theology. As will become clear, I do not think Spinoza or his arguments are contradictory or inconsistent, but that they demand careful study to hold in tension what appears incompatible. In the conclusion, I will not remain agnostic to the many Spinozas, but neither will I present my own final portrait that would determine the scope and contribution of each of these thinkers. Rather, my aim is to examine the multiple parallels and incompatibilities with Bergson and with Deleuze, and not to promote a free-for-all, or insinuate that there is no determinable, coherent core to Spinoza's, Bergson's, or Deleuze vantages. I find that the take what you want free-for-all, in which antagonistic schools appropriate different parts, tools, concepts, lenses, but not the whole or the insights needed to envelop them all, loses something that is of great value. While these incompatible appropriations have proven useful in the development of new modes of thought, they miss out on the power of thinking all of the incompatible elements together. That is, as they are woven dynamically across Spinoza's various projects and texts, and as only intuitive intelligence can apprehend. The risk with Deleuze's teaching of Spinoza is losing the ethical attachments maintaining the undissociated joy, which integrates the incompatibilities without neutralizing them. I will thus end with some general reflections on the project of philosophy as such, as well as the way we reread and interpret historical texts. Section 1. Deleuze Incompatibilist Pluralism. Far from denying the existence of duration, Spinoza defines the continual variation of existence by duration, and seems in fact to consider it the last refuge of the bad. Deleuze Practical Philosophy, page 39. While Deleuze has been instrumental in speeding up and fomenting a resurgence of interest and scholarship in both Spinoza and Bergson, both sympathetic and polemic scholars have also resisted aspects of his readings. Typical sympathetic interpretation explains away or ignores the incompatibilities of Bergson and Spinoza by means of Deleuzian concepts, so that their relation is understood through his transgressive differential metaphysics. A becoming sweeps themes and strategies away from their original embeddedness in traditional polemics and doctrines, sets them free in lines of flight. This implies extracting and transforming the operative methodologies, and, at its best, is disburdening them from the false problems and badly stated questions of history, while remaining at risk of contracting involuntary dissociations, ignoring and repressing the counter tendencies. Ford baldly reformulates the basic form of Deleuze appropriation as follows. Deleuze seeks to, quote, repeat the gesture by which these thinkers resist the move to transcendence. It is a question, not of content, but of method. Deleuze marches forward with Spinoza and Bergson to his left and right, under the banner of the philosophy of immanence and difference. Deleuze's original philosophy comes about by mobilizing their methodologies, adapting them to new problems, undistracted by the clash of crystallized doctrines. He dissociates from these concerns to pursue a creative project unencumbered by them. While there is a virtue here, a power worth wielding in moderation, we risk erasing and forgetting the present question. Can Deleuze really be both Bergsonian and Spinozist? Before pressing these questions of incompatibility, we must give voice to the many lines of resonance, what we might call a resonance without resemblance. It is not by artificial fabrication that Deleuze could unite ideas from Spinoza and Bergson, not by misreading them, and yet, while what I found in my research on this question surprised me, namely that many of the compelling compatibilities, parallels, and resonances are not overly Deleuzian themed, and some are even divergent and incompatible with Deleuze's own philosophical commitments. I would go so far as to call for a post-Deleuzian revival of the moral psychology and metaphysics of generosity found in both, yet largely abandoned by Deleuze's extreme or exaggerated rejection of attachments. Following Actas, his ethical minimalism commits to an infinitesimally small standard for the event, that it be new. Spinoza and Bergson propose much more restrictive commitments to articulating the goal and standard of philosophy and ethics, not merely maximizing novelty or intensity, but also composing and optimizing shared intensities, collaborative, active affects that are not exhausting, but rather regenerative and cautiously protects and preserves the multiplicity, plasticity, and potency. Acknowledging the philosophical value of freely lifting ideas from the history of philosophy, while also remaining committed to tracing incompatibilities and attending to the nuances of difference, we may still ask a further line of questions. Could we say that Deleuze has a greater alliance to one or the other of the two? Who did he take more from? Whose work did he have to abandon more of? Did he Bergsonify Spinoza more than the reverse? Or, if absolute freedom is a persistent commitment for Deleuze, a theme perhaps borrowed from Sartre, yet transformed, it will be hard not to see him slightly closer to Bergson and the indeterminacy of free expression. Deleuze is sort of a compatibilist, insofar as he accepts aspects of both necessity and freedom from the Stoics, Lucretius, Spinoza, and Bergson, and yet he also professed a metaphysical incompatibilism by refusing to dissolve the incompatibilities in freedom and necessity, even making it constitutive of reality and the will. That is, the three syntheses of time and difference of repetition, or the coexistence of the integral past and the planes of movement and the 1,000 integral planes of consciousness in Bergsonism. Thus, compatibility and incompatibility shape Deleuze's various commitments to freedom and necessity, if these labels still have any use for us in the Deleuzean field of problems and concepts, or even in Bergson for that matter. One might well say that Deleuze had already surpassed the frame of concepts in which compatibilism is a useful label, just as he abandoned the common sense that Bergson wielded in the name of freedom. Compatibilism might well have appeared to him as answering a false problem, born of the representational image of thought, which sees necessity and freedom as an antinomy or logical contradiction. The incongruence of compatibilism and incompatibilism might rather be viewed as ontologically generative, creativity as such. Affectivity, motion, intensity, all that cannot be represented or made fully present to consciousness, envelops the incompatibilities without resolution, generate a dynamic philosophy of difference. Deleuze's ideas reflect the very pluralistic affirmation of incongruent ingredients, not just diverse, even incompatible inspirations, but a fortiori, the affirmation that ingredients of reality itself are not just irreducibly different, but incompatible, and that this is generative of sense and existence. And before continuing, let me say that I love Deleuze and that his work was not only massively formative for me, but that it is because of him that I came to read Spinoza and Bergson, not exclusively, but decisively. Wherever my synoptic gathering leads in what follows, know that I do not wish to dismiss, take down, or diminish his inimitable contribution, but to augment, suspend, and syncopate what has become functionally muted in its reception. Section 2, reading them with and against each other. Bergson's philosophical intuition of duration as creative invention, from which his view of freedom took shape, emerged in response to the Cartesian philosophies as much as the mechanists like Spencer, and of course to the intellectualism of Kant. In the final analysis, when measuring his own contribution to philosophy, Bergson reports he rejected the system of Spinoza, overcoming its weakness and exaggerations, necessity and determinism, hyper-rationalism that eliminates freedom, overvalues geometry, and gets stuck in the empty notion of static eternity. He believed this story he told in his lectures and monographs, I am certain, since his tune stays largely the same across his early and late works. Rejecting Spinoza's account of psychological automata structures the flow of the text of his doctoral thesis from start to finish. The very framing of the qualitative multiplicity of psychological states as intensive, heterogeneous multiplicities in Time and Free Will comes from a gloss of Spinoza's descriptions of the affects such as pity in Ethics Part 3, Proposition 22, and its progression towards compassion in Proposition 27's third corollary, and generosity in Proposition 37, Scholium. But Bergson also painted Spinoza's modes as mechanistic, rather than finding in the complex relational structure of modes a dynamic and self-organizing causality that creates no break in the absolute necessity of reality, while allowing for a multiplicity of singular expressions of free necessity, kanatos, in living organisms. Bergson apparently does not see this dynamic and organismic face of necessity that appears in the progressive intensification of active affects, a gradual emerging freedom that transforms the sensory motor system so that our action and participation in collective actions bring an increase of joy and virtue. Bergson also gave some leeway in developing what we could call a deconstructive strategy, reading Spinoza against himself. Bergson writes that, for Spinoza, there are thrusts of intuition that cause this system to crack. This mirrors the statements in the Freedom course. Quote, Spinoza was an intellectualist by the effort of the will, and there are passages in the Ethics, especially in his last book, where Spinoza's intellectualism seems ready to crack, as it were, due to the effects of an inner thrust or an inner pressure. This inner pressure comes, of course, from the intensive affects, the joy and expressive power involved in intuitive knowledge. Despite being more amenable to a durational, intensive view of affects than Bergson typically acknowledges, there are some real, perhaps insurmountable differences that remain. By focusing on intensity as qualitative, continuous multiplicity in time and free will, we see that Bergson thinks through and beyond Spinozan affects to find indetermination as indispensable to them. The progression of complex emotion described in chapter 1 of Time and Free Will. He gives the examples of pity and aesthetic sentiments. These exhibit two anti-Spinozan affirmations, indetermination and a non-mechanical process of invention. But Bergson errs by over-mechanizing Spinoza, losing the dynamic sense of infinity made intelligible through intensity. The introduction of indetermination is authentically anti-Spinozan, but this begins to fall apart on further scrutiny. If Bergsonian indetermination adds some genuinely new form of causal efficacy, is it meaningfully different from the nuanced view of Spinoza, the formal reality of an idea that determines us to act and think by the content of its affirmation in Part 2, Proposition 49 of the Ethics? The fundamental point of irreconciliation hinges on the meaning of geometry. Bergson takes it, in its most superficial sense, as quantity and space, rather than in relation to essence, idea, and infinity, as Spinoza does. Bergson defines matter as duration being weighed down by geometry. Nevertheless, he concedes in the same passage of Creative Evolution that there is an essence of both life and consciousness, reopening the door to a Spinozan organismic view of geometrical essences. Spinoza's singular essences are the causal influence of a self-organizing force, the autopoietic causal influence in all living things. By treating the emotions as if they follow the same necessity as the composition of lines and surfaces and figures in geometry, does not entail anything mechanistic or quantitative, but, as we will see, encompasses the vital activity of the organism. Perhaps there is something like a law of composition that says that the composition of two essences introduces a new essence irreducible to its components. The parts as integrated in the whole are different than the parts existing uncomposed. Compositional essences are unique essences. Recall that power, virtue, conatus, perfection, and essence are nearly synonymous, if not fully, and, quote, desire is the very essence or nature of each person, end quote, even though each term is defined separately and should not be completely collapsed into each of the others. He explicitly states that, quote, the first essence of the mind is the conatus of the body, and that our essence, therefore, can become something else, can change. Desire is the conatus as directed by an affect of pleasure or pain, love or hate. Quote, we see, therefore, that the mind can undergo great changes. Sometimes it passes to greater perfections, sometimes to lesser perfections, end quote. Each affect composes a specific way of endeavoring, compounded out of the particularities of the essences stemming from the emotional and situational particulars. Joy has the essential feature of increasing one's power of acting, virtue, and perfection, expanding and enriching our essence. The path of joy leads to the highest endeavoring, our highest virtue, which is also our highest singular essence. And in the third kind of cognition, depends on the mind as the formal cause, insofar as the mind itself is eternal. End quote. Our essence becomes an intuitive, intellectual love of God, since what we are is our desire, and the more we understand singular things intuitively, the more we understand God, and the more we act from piety and generosity. This perspective of essence as unique, eternal, and infinite is not at odds with the gradual transformation of our essence as we become virtuous and free. At its base is the geometrical notion that essences are infinitely expressive and compound to form new singular essences. Summers Hall goes so far as to say that freedom for Bergson has a somewhat Spinozistic edge, as the rejection of external determination in order to reach a state where we act from our own nature. End quote. We can press the issue to Bergson. Does life not, in a sense, necessitate the effect of indetermination? If indetermination does something, if it has an effect, then we would have to say it implies the determination of an effect. Nothing exists which does not produce an effect. Part 1 of the Ethics, Proposition 36. And the effect of life is ultimately the increasing, expanding power of positive indetermination. We find this efficacy in our determination in Creative Evolution, Chapter 2, where life is the ongoing participation between plants and animals, the first storing up and the latter expending energy, each exhibiting a psychological pattern of dissociation. Humanity is a continuation of this process, creatively evolving towards mobility and enriching experience. Indetermination cannot be impotent, but is rather a fecundity, which is to say that it determines things to exist or move in a certain way. Bergsonian freedom distributes its metaphysical incompatibilities across time, placing necessity into the back half of duration in the past as the necessity of irreversibility and irrevocability. The past will necessarily always be what it already is, but the future, in duration, has a genuine, originary, or non-derivative reality that really exists. The real existence of a non-being of the future, its contingency. With this comes everything that Parmenidean logic cannot admit exists. Movement is virtual rather than actual. But the past is also virtual for Bergson, and is actualized only in its shadow effect on contingent life events. Quote, "The whole of our past psychic life conditions our present state, without being its necessary determinant." End quote. The virtuality thus envelops both necessity and indetermination, and it is in and through memory's power of conditioning life and consciousness that they coexist while remaining incompatible. If they can coexist, they cannot be true contraries, so that contingent is not unnecessary, nor does necessity preclude contingent. There is something non-necessary about contingency, borrowing Spinoza's term from Part 4, Proposition 11. And while nothing necessary must be contingent, the non-contingent and non-necessary allows us to think each without strictly opposing them to one another. And that is essential to understanding the activity of thought. Bergson defines consciousness by a hesitation that takes advantage of indetermination in a variety of useful ways. Both moral and philosophical intuition exceed conscious awareness, just as the whole past, all at once, so to speak, contextualizes every particular perception or memory, marking it as a unique singularity. The fringe of consciousness is where necessities refract into interpenetrating virtualities, from which we imagine possibilities relevant to the contingencies of the given concrete situation. Affordants are singularities that constitute our power, and while we typically only evaluate them based on induction, the future will resemble the past, we can also open to their propensity to form new compositions that we can't yet imagine, that are inexplicable in terms of our past experiences. At a given moment of recollection, the total system is not equally brought into relevance, but rather by intricate gradations of valence shading into oblivion. The past shapes the living moment of our duration. The grading of relevance implies dissociations, which psychologically operate as organic wholes, kaleidoscopically, rather than atomic information erased or represented cinematographically. The past does not actualize itself, since it cannot recur, but while remaining ineffectual, as he says in Matter of Memory, and impassible, it nevertheless indirectly affects the present by passing into it via the sensory motor system, as he says in Matter of Memory. We cannot think or recollect the whole past at once, but we also cannot think or remember anything without it standing out from our whole past and finding its meaning in the very stance it takes on the rest of the past. Indetermination in the hesitation before executing a plan wherein we either revise our tactics or find a new way to play a different game altogether. In such cases, indeterminacy loosens the grip of some necessities, insinuates itself into the meshes, and implicates novel movements and meanings. But only if it thereby sequesters new necessities by which it determines things to be in a certain way. Hesitation is unhelpful if it cannot foment a useful action, if it cannot accomplish a new formation. We can see the causal efficacy of indetermination implicated in the complexity of the sensory motor system, as consonant with free necessity of Spinozist expressionism. Do we risk losing what is most particular to Spinoza, as Bergson put it, quote, the most perfect and most complete expression of the most absolute determinism, end quote. Such is the thicket of problems that we would do well to keep wrestling with without collapsing it. Turning to focus solely on the topics where Spinoza and Bergson overlap, we will better prepare ourselves to return to the question of freedom. Part 3, Mapping Consonances. 3.1, Movement. Both Bergson and Spinoza take issue with the views of motion and extension found in Descartes. I will not dwell on this question that Thayer already credibly asserted in 1919. They shared commitment to an irreducible reality of movement, and that Spinoza's famous Natura Naturans, literally nature naturing, nature as the active productivity, grants an interiority and non-spatial essence to movement, the indivisibility of extension, in Part 1, Proposition 15, as an attribute denotes the power to move, motricity, and even the integration of complex sensory motor systems, all indivisible in their activity. In short, motion need not be motion of something, but that motion can be the very substantiality of corporeality. This finds voice in Bergson's perennial distinction between reality in the making, real duration, life, and the ready-made, the structure of conceptual knowledge, solids of geometry. This would point us back to a conception of movement in Spinoza that's still moving, rather than a movement already having moved. It is indeed extremely difficult to conceive of a movement in itself that is not reduced to the accident of a solid. The dynamisms of reality, forming complex chains of free necessity, conceived as living movement, bring a certain alignment of these two thinkers' perspectives. That is, from the vantage of affect and intensity. Bergson distanced himself from what he saw as Spinoza's mechanical interpretation of the body, but this interpretation can be thrown into question, as we find in Hans Jonas. Yet, if we follow the thread of infinity, the way infinity functions for both thinkers, we again begin to dissolve many incompatibilities. If infinity is more important than mechanism, if it is employed ontologically and expressively, then we again find a shared vantage, a dynamic continuum of movements and konatai, a plenum of centers and interdependent cycles linking up in ratios. A multiplicity of movements that are self-organized by immanently expressed ratios clearly are greater than the sum of forces they integrate and divide. Each living whole is more than the parts, even if it is inconceivable without its parts, without the living multiplicity of forms across which it continuously transitions. And every whole is less than the totality of its parts because it depends on the whole of nature. Placing infinity above the finite, making finite modes the shadow of our imagination working for practicality, linking the effort to expand and develop life's virtues and to share them with others, infinity becomes the motive and motif of a shared intuition between Bergson and Spinoza. The general shape of philosophical progress is the same. We must undo many habitual ways of thinking because we naturally begin thinking purely in relation to symbols and space, and we must end in an intuition. We are using an inferior faculty when we see things as independent substances fragmented by our practical needs, while in reality everything is deeply interwoven in a fabric of movements that is the whole of nature. Look at Bergson's view of matter in the first chapter of Matter and Memory. He takes matter as a phenomenon that is embedded in our sensory motor schema, as an ingredient in living consciousness, and you will find he makes of matter a plane of images and cites Leibniz, who he updates with Michael Faraday and Lord Kelvin. Rather than atoms in space, we should think of fields of forces immanent in a plenum of reciprocal relations. In Creative Evolution, he describes them as a vortex, a behavior, and concerted movement, rather than a solid or a pattern. He symbolizes the relation of matter and consciousness in the third chapter of Matter and Memory with the diagram of the plane and inverted cone. With this, he traced the incompatibilism between the plane of memory and the plane of matter. Life and consciousness appear miraculously in the integration of spirit and matter. Between them, as a mixture of both, consciousness emerges in an infinity of unique degrees of tension. Nothing of this structure appears readily in Spinoza, and Bergson clearly had Plotinus in mind when he conceived of the diagram. And while rejecting the intellectualism and static necessitarianism of Plotinus, he also pinned on Spinoza. He nevertheless made use of Plotinus to form and defend his own understanding of the dynamics of mental life, even when he was engaging with his contemporaries. We will examine later Spinoza's parallelism denies interplay between matter and mind. Above all, even at the level of pure movement, the law of nature is already organismic, not merely mechanical, as Bergson said. Hans Jonas in 1967 offered a compelling reading of Spinoza's physical digression as rather meant to describe the organism and its sensory motor system as complex autopoietic processes rather than as a mechanism. This is exactly what the 6 postulates Spinoza gave at the end of the physical digression provide: a description of the human organism and its complex sensory motor system. There is a consonance without resemblance between the moving, kaleidoscopic images of Bergson's matter and memory and an organic structure of the imagination in the emotions of Spinoza. Following Vilhanen, 2011, the efficient cause is not mechanistic or a transitive cause, but rather relates to a dynamic sense of activity linked to power and the free necessity of essence. Nothing exists whose essence, from their essence, some effect does not follow. Meaning, there are no existences without causal efficacy. Every existence produces an effect. The emergent properties of organically composed individuals introduce causal factors not found in the parts. The ratios and proportions of motion and rest involve a novel essence with powers unique to the composition. For both Bergson and Spinoza, the dynamic unity of the living, moving body, our sensory motor system, is essential to philosophy. We must educate the senses rather than leave them behind. As an artist learns to see things outside their mere practical use and can perceive and act on things in many ways, undissociated, by this or that particular interest, by approaching reality through the efficient cause in relation to power and through the positive reality of movement. Both Spinoza and Bergson anticipate aspects of Whitehead's process philosophy and Deleuze's philosophy of difference. Section 3.2, Purpose. By pursuing a dynamic metaphysics that takes seriously the reality of movement, both Spinoza and Bergson were also profoundly critical of teleological arguments, and especially with respect to any interpretation of final causes as determined by static, eternal, universal forms that stand outside nature and coerce conformity, or decree that all nature exists for the sake of human enjoyment. But on the question of teleology, both authors appear to violate their own edicts and to reintroduce a crypto-finalism that escapes the problems of the classical theories that they critique by making use of a common sense notion of purposive action. Teleology needs radical overhaul, since the imagination's concepts of ends, born of practical life, is unable to explain itself. But purposive action can be expressed instead as a dynamic emergence of imminently set and negotiated goals, such as we find in the strivings of life. After banishing teleology in the appendix to Part 1 of the Ethics, Spinoza goes on later, in the preface to Part 4, to grant the purposiveness of appetites a pedagogical and heuristic role in the cultivation of virtue, perfection as our intelligence's valuation of what is useful to preserving and expanding knowledge. The lifelong process by which one progresses to greater and greater active affects, escapes bondage to passions, learns to follow the dictates of reason, gradually achieves virtues and blessedness, etc. It is a path of effort and devotion, not only filled with a sense of purpose, but generative of new and greater purpose, value, and meaning. Thus, Part 4 traces good and bad, notions that Spinoza denies have any objective reality in ideas as experienced judgments of usefulness and as useful for ordering our affects. Insofar as we learn what is useful is understanding, which not only makes knowledge of God the highest virtue, but even makes the effort to cultivate intelligence and share it with others the highest priority of the free person. The incompatibility is not a fault of contradiction, but maps the transformation that must occur in us. Forget the false sense of freedom, which is nothing but following our uncontrollable appetites. Learn what real freedom consists of without thinking we already have achieved it too hastily. Spinoza's caute, his caution. For Bergson, teleology is practical to daily life and even essential to science, which deterministically enacts its essence to analyze, measure, and control matter. The intellect marches towards empty space just as matter dissipates entropy. But life expresses another tendency that reintroduces purposive action in the form of creative improvisation and the method of intuition. Metaphysics arises only when we act with a purpose, when we use the mind to understand the mind and draw more from ourselves than we contain. We require a disinterested state, almost dreamlike, a sort of hyper-dream state in which we surpass all our mental faculties, not by suppressing our intelligence, but using it in a way that is wholly unsuited to operate, outside of conceptual schema of space and utility. Now, again, for Spinoza, the conatus is all that it is at every moment. It is a perfection. Even though it perpetually changes and is aiming at improving itself, even as it pushes and surpasses its limits, it is still at its limit, and immanently defines itself as a measure of perfection. Affects are the increase or decrease of power, setting a limit for itself or increasing itself. There is a positive reality even to the most extreme sadness. It still involves a perfection, a power of existing. From our consciousness of our power emerges an appetite, a vocation to persevere, grow, enrich, and expand this power and perfection. Something like an imperative, immanent to the operative intelligence, to exalt itself and other intelligences. Intellectual generosity is the natural result of the emendation of the intellect, but the path there takes effort, and there is a residue of teleology that scholars have insisted on tracing. The temporal shape of finality cannot be, like motion for Zeno, argued away with logic, but can be transformed and reframed and reinscribed into an ontology of intensity and the necessity by which freedom is actualized by intelligence in duration. Raymond Rouillet rightly traces a new constellation between the problems of meaning, sens, and the problem of teleology, claiming that the ontological question of the medieval and early modern metaphysics, which rested on teleology, had, from Bergson to Merleau-Ponty, shifted the ontological and metaphysical problem of God to the problem of sense. Rouillet's axiology asserts that no one could ever fully reject every form of teleology from their thought without giving up on the project of ridding themselves of teleology. At some point, the needs of life take back over, and our tacit assent to teleology resumes. Get up and use the restroom or go eat lunch. One cannot oppose teleology or affirm non-teleological explanations without tacitly affirming a telos. Intending to say something true or useful, and undertaking an anticipatory action that is indispensable to attention and sense-making more generally. How can we reject teleology without acting with a goal? How can we reject teleology without acting with a goal? At the minimum, communicating some meaning to others. No doubt Spinoza meant to say something true. This is a question of exaggerations by both Spinoza and Bergson that makes their work so thought-provoking. Filippo De Lucchese has made an admirable effort to press the issue of teleology, strengthening our appreciation for the ground conquered in ontology by Spinoza's anti-teleological movements. But the very project of ridding our interpretation of Spinoza, or even of interpreting Spinoza at all, retains a shadow teleology in the orientations and norms it enacts. Thus, for both thinkers, the anti-teleological movement is practical. Even the concrete interruption of our goal-oriented ways of being, the attention to life, is needed for the progression of both ethics and metaphysics. The teleology of the imaginations cognitively structures a game of praise and blame that is the engine of superstition and envy, affects that keep people at variance to one another. For Bergson, teleological thinking is equally natural to humans as mechanical thinking. Both are based on concepts, representations, symbolic generalizations, such as the designs used in manufacturing, and that these wholly practical garments of thought have no useful application to understanding the essence of life, even though they are essential to life. In the first chapter of Creative Evolution, Bergson shows that teleology and biological finalism can be retailored to better fit the contours of life. He rehabilitates, but reverses Leibniz's external teleology, while wholly discarding the internal finality of German idealism, though less so of Schelling. In the third and fourth chapters of Creative Evolution, Bergson traces a teleological fatalism inherent to the intellect in its inclination towards geometrical abstraction. Space, pure exteriority, and uniformity are the furthest aspirations of intelligence left to itself. Bergson surpasses teleology by a higher purposiveness immanently engendered in concrete duration. But outside of intuitive science, the mind is subject to inevitable determinations. The key for thinking through and beyond anti-teleology depends on posing the question of teleology in a highly nuanced way, instead of relying on representational models that deploy prefabricated plans, that is, structures afford a function that solves a problem. Purposiveness is an immanent normativity, an unrepresentable directionality and vectoral quality that permeates a multiplicity. An orientation at the level of formal reality that adds nothing to the objective reality, but is the very directionality differently expressed across the whole system. Immanence here refers to the creation and evaluation of a norm as a self-assessment born of an intrinsic motivation. Within the convergence of the notion of necessity on the one hand and freedom on the other, efficient cause as dynamic rather than mechanical, as well as by understanding activity and passivity with as little teleology as possible, we escape teleology as the mother of all prejudices for a purposive directedness born of a supple variety of reason, or even the intuitive knowledge that surpasses reason. For Bergson, the forces and organization of evolution are not teleological in terms of the determination of specific structures, but life retains a shadow of teleological structuring, reframed in terms of tendencies. There is no telos predetermining the emergence of the eyeball, but its actual development on divergent lines of evolution attests to a vis a tergo that informs becoming from a metaphysical, impersonal memory that desires self-expression through mobility, sensitivity, flexibility, and ultimately in mystical vision. For Bergson, consciousness, personality, and thought depend on a principle of dissociation, opposed to associationism, not as simply reversing it, disconnecting one atomic sensation from another, but a global sense of psychological dissociation in which one represses a mass of perceptions and memories by distraction. Be it daydreaming or catatonia, the mind splits off into a subpersona of the total living being. The active state of focused consciousness represses what is irrelevant to remaining focused. Dissociation implies a natural teleology of an inevitability in life, the attention to life, and its inevitable fall into torpor and intellectualism. Life modulates the relevance of its memories and habits, acting on the fringe of consciousness, on the periphery, but which guides its own creative evolution without having any design or predetermined plan, without representing itself in advance. Rather, through an ongoing improvisation, unbroken from billions of years ago to now, still in our deep impersonal memory, and mixing themes that are habituated by culture or remembered from among the singular events of life. The force of inertia behind forms of knowledge, institutions, and traditions all render resistance to the free exercise of philosophy, a dissociative repression of the complexity of life or of the collateral damage of technology is pervasively accepted for its seemingly obvious existence. Who denies that there are material utilities, affordances, and that materially complex bodies are variably purposive? Intellect hurls itself beyond the practical into the eternal static form of geometric figures. Addicted to this ease of representation, our intellect starves itself of any intensive dynamic intimacy and have no way of expressing the reality of life. It is like the gradual withering that a fictional mobile plant would suffer that hides every day from the sun and came out only at night to feed on the pale, impotent moonlight. Teleology and mechanism both poorly explain some behavior of life in a mutilated form, starved and disintegrated. They conceive the formation of life on the process by which things die. Stripped of all preformist themes and external determinations of universal type forms, the pre-personal essence of life, kanatos, harbors and develops a radically revisionary telos that lives virtually in a multiplicity as a horizon of possibilities, an excess of actuality transporting itself across shifting horizons. The surging forth of vital energy does not drain its reservoir. Spirit is strengthened by habit and by integrating emotions and memories. Life grows to encompass a larger and larger expansion of awareness and power. Can we now go so far as to say that the existence of the kanatos necessitates an injection of indeterminacy into the net of determinations in order to make living movements organize out of antagonistic inertia? The further we advance with active affects, the more we come to not only store up and maintain our power of acting, but to enrich them and share them. The intelligent body is one that most expands and enriches the horizon of its possibilities by which it can act and compose itself with others. The inner tendency of living bodies, and above all the necessity for intelligence in human affairs, creates an imperative to intensify the essence of life, and even to transform and transvalue it with the guide of reason and the love of God. There's something in the very nature of loving each other as humans, as modes that depend on one another, whose organization always involves intelligence, and yet there's something in materiality, in the movements we enact together, and in the ideas and affects that are the real contours of our coexistence, and that makes forms of teleology inevitable in human life. As we love each other, ourselves, and God, we are led to a normative structure informing not only practical life, but philosophy and metaphysics, with the commitment of cultivating joy and the shareable empowerment of understanding. Thus, morality for Spinoza and Bergson is my own post-established harmony as the normative pull that we feel to pursue philosophy. Our preferences and our needs for rigor and depth, purposiveness is ontological and metaphysical primacy. Levinas announced ethics as first philosophy. He was merely meeting up with Spinoza and Bergson, going where they had gone, and then set off in a new direction from within their projects. One cannot be in any way a Spinozist or Bergsonian without pursuing the project of intensive variation, of modifying and improving one's very power of philosophizing. Spinoza and Bergson both intended their philosophies to benefit us. Worked tirelessly towards the goal of leading us towards our own intuitive and inventive activities, productive of philosophical truth. Section 3.3, Intuition and Spirit. By now, one will not struggle to see parallels between each of their uses of intuition, withstanding the shift of focus from eternity to duration, since both seem to take intuition as a mix of the eternal and the transient. For Spinoza, intuition involves active affects, which presumably can be said to involve duration as an event of the increase of power. While for Bergson, duration always involves an element of pastness, that is, eternal and necessary. We can bring Bergson and Spinoza together on intuition, but it's clear that they will never admit of complete superimposition, diverging on the role of intelligence and habit, while themes from each encroach on aspects of the other's vantage, like binocular vision, which can merge to form one image only for so long, and while we ignore the moments where the two images fail to merge, as when an object appears in one eye and not in the other, due to the positioning and perspective. The truth is that the depth that all binocular images make visible is evidence that they never merge completely, and thus the depth wouldn't exist without the difference. The question is to identify what is placed into relief as well as what is visible in only one or the other of the eyes. Intensity is the most prominent common ground between the three eyes looking at Bergson, Deleuze, and Spinoza, despite the fact that the latter never thematized the term intensity. The conatus must be considered as ontologically intensive, as well as power and perfection. Astesiano exalts the intensive depth of joy, liberty, and mysticism as apparitions arising from Spinoza that haunt Bergson long after he thinks he's discarded them. It's the confidence or spiritual fortitude by which one has tasted the joy of virtue, liberty, and mysticism now demands of life the expansion and enrichment of these powers. As Astesiano states in the abstract preface and conclusion, the term mysticism in these two authors designates neither the refusal of experience nor of positive science, but amounts to a rationalism enlarged to the love of the real. End quote. Such a reading relies on what we might call the vantage of love, without which there would be no movement to life. Spinoza's third kind of knowledge, the intellectual intuition, is born of and an expression of the intellectual love of God. This appears to connect with the Hebrew jada, which is an intimate knowledge through love, from the Theological Political Treatise. And taking this in connection with his discussion of ruah, breath and spirit, in the same text, which he associates with moral intuition akin to the ideas of geometrical essences. Likewise, Bergson makes mystical love of God, agape, the quintessential expression of the élan vital. Above and beyond these parallels, we have one more remarkable component holding them in fellowship. The mystical love of God involves not only a disciplined philosophical intuition, but even a companionship with science. Section 3.4, Cooperation of Metaphysics and Science. The question of precision marked the opening lines of the Introduction to the Creative Mind, first written in 1922, which traces the transforming research project of Bergson's major works. Metaphysics lacks precision, and each of his books contributes in increasing it. The standard for precision differs greatly in science and metaphysics. The former uses quantitative abstractions and symbols, whereas the latter relies on sympathy, methodology, and integration. It wouldn't be too far off to say that since duration is precisely what we are, that taking it as originary is a step towards absolute precision. Just as instinct is often perfectly precise, so too intuition can have an intimate, sympathetic knowledge. But unlike instinct, philosophical intuition must maintain contact, tarry with natural knowledge of science. This includes understanding its observations and theories, as well as critiquing the pseudo-concepts it formulates, perfectly logical solutions to badly stated or false problems. Many of its theories are more like defense mechanisms, fabricated in order to keep oneself from having to confront all the repressed content related to subjectivity. A scientifically sharpened mind needs the psychotherapy of metaphysics to keep it from cutting itself off from life, dissociating from the whole of reality, the singularity of concrete life. Metaphysics relies on returning to the singularity and fluidity of duration, but does not end in the singular and concrete. Like science, it must produce something universal and abstract. It must formulate its findings in language and construct a body of knowledge that is shareable and co-workable. Astesiano goes so far as to say that Bergson is a classical philosopher and even a rationalist who makes philosophy a form of knowledge grounded in experience and reasoning, accessible in principle to all, rejecting faith fundamentalists or scientific positions, as well as the dominant 21st century idea of surpassing of metaphysics, whether by poetry, logic, the human sciences, or other means. End quote. Bergson is committed to correcting metaphysics and insists that this depends, in large part, on each of us coming to maintaining a healthy relation to science, defending its power while not overselling it, leaving room for spirit, and at the same time fighting off the overblown metaphysics that distorts our understanding of reality by rejecting the science of nature or our condition as embodied. Bergson tackles this question head-on in his text Psychophysiological Parallelism and Positive Science in 1901 with a remarkable synoptic vantage, weaving science and metaphysics into a moral framing of the task of philosophy and life. This text vividly displays a living image of metaphysics as dynamically engaging with science without dissociating from morally enriching action and integrating incongruent vantages. Is a question of attachment and release, each of which can be good and bad in different circumstances. Attachments can build intensity, but also become stagnant. Release, detachment, can be freeing and can foster creativity, but taken to the extreme is schizophrenic and even eventually catatonic. By balancing and modulating attachment and release, we do not synthesize or reduce one to the other, but make use of the very play between the extremes when held in tension. Science cannot operate without the purposively oriented lived duration of the scientist, even though scientists often dissociate from every evidence of their own subjectivity. Above all, the fluidity and singularity of concrete duration are erased and repressed in the scientific myopia. For Bergson, science and metaphysics must maintain a certain incompatibility. Quote, science, in fact, gives us knowledge of an absolute that can be measured, and metaphysics an absolute that escapes all measure. The belief according to which science or metaphysics could, one or the other, encompass the whole of reality and explain everything remains illegitimate. End quote. We must rather keep them engaged with one another, maintaining them in a productive tension. In this way, we follow the grain of reality rather than what is easiest for our intelligence, bent on clarifying things. But that ends up nullifying them. Reality is constituted by the coexistence of incompatible ingredients, the movement of present becoming, and the immovable being of the past, the intensive and the extensive, the unrepresentable and the representable, a world of science and a life of metaphysics. We must, once again, strive to form a binocular image rather than glance between the two dissociated worlds or pretending to snuff out one or the other. With this commitment, Bergson is not only classical, but even Aristotelian, as is Spinoza. And Deleuze's own project continues this commitment to making a metaphysics that is adequate to the contemporary state of the sciences, especially those of biology and psychology. Section 3.5, Envy and the War Instinct. In relation to political philosophy, there is little difference in the general orientation between Spinoza and Bergson, particularly on the goal of abolishing war. Both identify a general agitation and strife between humans as constitutive of moral life. The human condition is such that, unless something is done to amend our spirit, humans will disagree and will be burdensome to one another rather than work together. Like the growing habits of grapes, which, from thousands of years of cultivation, have come to rely on human intervention to be healthy and productive, and if left unmaintained, become overgrown and disease-ridden. Like the abundance of these cultivars, human powers have unproductive, even self-destructive tendencies if left to themselves. For Bergson, closed morality and society follow from a war instinct, while for Spinoza, there is a natural state of bondage to sad passions rooted in superstition and envy, setting humans at variance and preventing our ascension to active affects. Without the intervention of cultivation, we fall prey to the law of appetite. Bergson's discussion of the war instinct are not only central to his moral philosophy, but can be seen as a further development of Spinoza's themes. Both Spinoza and Bergson reject Hobbesian view that sees the constant state of war itself as natural, but rather that a war instinct is natural, actual war is artificial, and a counter tendency is also natural, a spontaneous, sympathetic, and reasonable activity that drives us to abolish war. Thus, the advent of war and its abolition are each natural, while the latter implies a greater expression of our power. The former stunts our moral development and gets us into a frenzied fugue state that is difficult to slow down. For Bergson, quote, "The origin of war is ownership, individual or collective, and since humanity is predestined to ownership by its structure, war is natural. So strong, indeed, is the war instinct that it is the very first to appear when we scratch below the surface of civilization in search of nature." End quote. It has become natural in the way luxuries become necessities, and habits become second nature. An addiction is at once insatiable while demanding perpetual satisfaction. The withdrawal of quitting becomes its own risk. Violence, rage, audacity, cruelty, abuse, etc. are addictive, consumable, and have a form of withdrawal that requires rehab. The war instinct manifests in both frenzy and discipline, and by appropriating tool-making intelligence, and, quote, "all these instincts of discipline originally converge towards the war instinct," end quote, which absorbs not only the entire structure of custom, forming national identity, but also, quote, "the industrious character of our civilization," end quote. That's from the Two Sources of Morality and Religion. Modern wars are not merely practical or even necessary, but follow from greed, luxury, and the sport of fighting. So, while the League of Nations aspired for the abolition of war, it was not prepared to suppress or remove the, quote, "deep-seated war instinct underlying civilization," end quote. The war instinct is at work both in the manifest systems and institutions of society, but also in the unconscious and affective registers of the psyche and the living body of the organism. Bergson describes the frenzy that he experienced in the start of the Great World War. World War I. Quote, "Think now of the enthusiasm of a people at the outbreak of a war. This is doubtless to a certain extent a defensive reaction against fear, an automatic stimulation of courage. But there is also the feeling that we were made for a life of risk and adventure, as though peace were but a pause between two wars. The enthusiasm quickly dies down as the suffering is considerable. If we leave out the last war, however, where the horror was beyond anything we believed possible, it is strange to see how soon the sufferings of war are forgotten in time of peace. The war instinct both co-opts rationality and abandons it in frenzy." End quote. Both closed society and the war instinct turn profit from habits' automatisms, which tend to erase the memories of atrocity and close off the heart from aspiring for war's abolition. Further, the war instinct has set up and exploited certain xenophobic tendencies. He points out a prevalent defensiveness towards, or even a disgust of foreigners emerging from the war instinct, and makes, quote, "every foreigner a virtual enemy," end quote. All of this is the exaggeration of natural tendencies, more or less, a lack of indeterminacy and hesitation, a lack of freedom, openness, and sympathy. Now, Bergson also insists that the origin of war is ownership, a claim passed along from Plato to Rousseau. But unlike these earlier accounts, Bergson does not offer a myth about the state of nature, but a historical genealogy. Spinoza, too, rejects that property and ownership are natural, but rather sees them as mere civil arrangements of custom. No doubt, the mother of all prejudices for Spinoza is envy, which arises from an egoist conception of free will. The cognitive structure of this mutilated idea holds the whole system of envious emotions working together that keeps humans at variance with each other. Envy is the sad pleasure of witnessing the suffering of someone you hate, or a pain of witnessing their enjoyment. Envy emerges from the mutilated idea that produces hate and fear, that others who we hate harm or threaten something we love. The false judgment implied in these affects provide mutilated rationalizations for hate that lead to war, how we become trapped in violent cycles that diminish our power of acting. Envy is related to and feeds fear and superstition. Everyone is naturally prone to these sad passions, according to the preface of the Theological Political Treatise. Furthermore, they fuel the bitterest hatred and an instability of the mind that races towards ferocious wars. Both Spinoza and Bergson orient us towards the abolition of war and situate the road to its realization in a love that mixes mysticism and science. Both sought to rebrand religion as a vehicle for averting war. While no doubt false religion and closed religion have contributed to wars, and we can assume historical figures exemplified this for both thinkers, such as William III of Orange for Spinoza, who exploited the Calvinist clergy and used state secrecy to sequester power. We must divest all disciplined rigor from the war effort, and the irrational mystical expansion must resist appropriation in war, disenthrall the mind while pursuing philosophical intuitions. Spinoza rebukes the isolationism and supremacy of the Hebrew state, where everyone is commanded to love his neighbor as himself, but hate his enemy. Hate cannot conquer hate, only love can, by transforming hate and weakness into love. According to both philosophers, the only solution to our war-torn predicament is mutual empowerment through freedom, one through a higher education, the cultivation of knowledge, temperament, and virtues. Violence and war require various dissociations that starve and disempower our spirit, and cruelty itself becomes an appetitive addiction that demands satisfaction. Section 4. Relation of mind and body, parallel or perpendicular. The question of parallelism needs to be carefully examined, since it's Spinoza's original doctrine, and while Bergson's critique is only directly applicable to his contemporary epiphenomenalism's use of parallelism, it does not entirely fit Spinoza. Possible breakages between the strict series of one-to-one correspondence of body and idea can be found across the ethics, such as the fact that every idea has a body that it is the idea of, but there are also ideas of ideas that apparently need no additional bodily support as they multiply, and that far from being a marginal observation, in fact, the ideas of ideas play a generative role in the reflective use of reason that crafts and improves the very methods of philosophy, what leads to the geometrical method stated in the Treatise on the Imitation of the Intellect. The formal reality of the mind, its activity considered as an operative intelligence, a quasi-transcendental structure of the mental action that is independent of its own content, even if it always has its content, and a fortiori, it's the operative orientation of life that elicits the content proper to perceptual appearances, and for the most part is organized around the pragmatic communication about matter. Perhaps Spinoza's maintains parallelism while allowing for ideas of ideas to subtly regulate and direct our thinking and movement. Perhaps a crack opens in the great diamond where indeterminacy and beauty enter in and modify its lattice of necessity. Spinoza thinks we can always point to another source of necessity within the intelligible field from which new forces and movements emerge. Can't the mind, for Spinoza, by the necessity of its own nature, draw more out of itself than it contains? Can it thus form the surplus of psychical energy that overflows its parallelism? Isn't this precisely what happens to our essence, sub specia eternitatis, from the vantage of eternity? Not according to Bergson's thought-provoking reading of Spinoza's parallelism via the metaphor of translation. If the Iliad is translated word for word into French and German, one could take the two translations and imagine one or the other was the original and the translation, when in fact they are each the translation of the Greek. The original text stands for the unity of the entity in substance, which is then expressed in two diverse attributes, a mode of thought and a mode of body, being two perfect translations of the original. Bergson overlooks the fact that the metaphor would destabilize the series, since a Latin translation would have no definite articles, and the other languages would involve other discrepancies, changes of word order, and syllable count, etc. Above all, it seems that, for Bergson, one of the two translations, that is, the mind or spirit, adds infinitely more to its translation and exaggerates every detail, creating an infinitely more vivid and meaningful text than the original. Or rather, if the original is our duration itself, then it is no text at all, and any translation is already interpretive. The material translation would symbolize the goal of perfectly mapping the transitive causality between brute forces in space. Bergson rebukes parallelism and asks us to rethink the psychophysiological relation through the evidence of duration and habituation. He concludes that the conscious state exceeds the physical state, and while it's impossible if the brain could come to the exact state a second time, nothing says that consciousness of that state needs to be exactly the same. Instead, a variety of conscious states can relate to the exact same motor schema, which relies on certain determinate cerebral states and processes. In the same way, Multiple memories can gather on the same horizon of consciousness when we hear a word or phrase or infer various connotations. In the final analysis, consciousness exceeds the brain state existing at an instant, and thought, memory, and even embodied intelligence exceed enduring flux of conscious awareness in the present. The integral of experience is always more than a mere totality of differentials. If parallelism is the simplest form of compatibilism, then Bergson's view of freedom rests on the incompatibility of a perpendicular relation of matter and memory. He describes a vertical intersection implying that this inequality and irreconcilable difference is constitutive. At the start of Chapter 3 of Matter and Memory, Bergson provides us with the first sketch of his anti-parallelism. He starts by treating pure memory, memory image, and perception as three continuous line segments, or rather than a line, as a single movement in which we cannot say where one segment starts and the other ends. What parallelism does is cut this continuity in half across the center, at the point which marks the representational memory image. Each side of the cut is conceived as changing in parallel to the other. Now, this line, artificially cut in half by the prejudice of analysis, is taken and rotated 90 degrees, placing pure memory at the top of a vertical line, terminating the segment of perception at the horizontal line perpendicular to it that represents the horizon of our perspective on the material world around us. Taken one step further, the diagram becomes the famous inverted cone and plane, representing the various degrees of tension and concentration of consciousness, from perception and motor habits up to our general ideas, associations, and beyond to memories. This perpendicularity represents the incongruence of our being as spiritual and material. Rie attempted to bring Spinoza's parallelism into conformity with Bergson's perpendicular model, maintaining parallelism beyond mechanistic determinism, and with the power to destabilize a one-to-one correspondence. Rather than this implying that bodies and ideas start affecting one another, which Spinoza rejects, it implies that there is more going on one side than the other at some particular moment, as the sleepwalker acts without consciousness, and in Part 5, we follow the links in the chain of our consciousness without being able to find a direct correlate in the body. These perpendicular models are indeed reformations of parallelism's commitment to a both and rather than an either or. And on a more generous reading of Spinoza that takes the organism, dynamic essences, and intuitive knowledge into account, his parallelism already cracks and flexes to the perpendicular forces of spiritual freedom. Section 5. Freedom through and beyond dissociation. To act freely is to recover possession of oneself and to get back into pure duration. Bergson in Time and Free Will. Freedom is not in nature an imperium in imperio. Matter and Memory. When a tendency is analyzed as it develops, each of the particular tendencies born in this way would like to preserve and develop everything in the primitive tendency that is not incompatible with the work in which it has specialized. Creative evolution. Freedom takes root in living consciousness by integrating intimate knowledge of what is compatible and conducive to concurrent concerted activity. It is a global condition of our psychical state as animated by dynamic adjustments to attention. It emerges when we voluntarily become distracted enough to focus. Freedom is a mode of attunement, or rather, the very modulation of attunement. When something of interest catches us, by attuning to the relevant behaviors and gestures of any given situation, we implicitly dissociate from what is irrelevant or what disrupts our active, attentive engagement. Bergson follows Pierre Genet and other spiritualist psychologists in foregrounding the tension of consciousness as a force of mental equilibrium that suppresses and dissociates in appropriate and useful ways to let our attention be open enough to avoid fixation, but focusable enough to build a steady train of thought, to keep to the plot, as we can follow what's going on in a conversation as topics interweave, while implicitly keeping the thread of a larger set of questions. This dynamic, flexible tension is what Bergson sloganized as the attention to life. This means simultaneously narrowing the field of memory, imagination, and sensation, and yet keeping open the possibility of noticing what is held beneath awareness. Ultimately, it requires us to consider realities that cannot be present to consciousness, but that are integral to all representing or presencing and all knowing. This open, voluntary attention, without which there is no freedom, arises first and foremost in the body when its complex sensory motor system is capable of being affected in many ways and doing many things. Typically, we think of dissociation as strictly the dysfunctional state, attention deficit, loss of a sense of oneself or reality, automatism, blacking out, fugue states, etc. A state in which psychical tension weakens. When executive function of integration completely collapses or splitting off, awareness dissociates and the body acts purely through habit without conscious awareness. Some splitting can occur even without impaired sensory motor function, as Spinoza pointed out about sleepwalkers, an observation that becomes a central case study in the psychophysiology of French spiritualism. For Bergson, dissociation is what achieves our alert state of awareness and explains our ability to follow a multiplicity of details, just as much as pathological states, which are nothing but dysfunctional dissociations and modifications or disintegrations of attention. Quote, "Life does not proceed by association and the addition of elements, but rather by dissociation and splitting." Creative Evolution. Against the associationism of mechanistic psychology, as much as the Kantian transcendental idealism, dissociation for Bergson explains how we come to form perceptions and thoughts. Where association is meant to build up our mental state of atomic parts, dissociation starts with the totality, with pure multiplicity as a nebulous mass, and achieves coherent experience by subtraction. Bergson describes this with the image of a telescope. Looking at a nebula canalizes by blocking out the rest of the whole visible field. Dissociations and automatisms, by their very nature, are not easily controlled, and in some sense, all our psychological problems are problems of attention, distraction, and dissociation. Like the airplane sent to drop the bomb that cannot be stopped in Dr. Strangelove, our automatisms run the risk of running us off a cliff. A single plane of consciousness is stuck in flight, an idée fixe, a fixed idea, ruminating on one way of interpreting that becomes an obsessive compulsion without the freedom to attune to different planes. Freedom comes from finding the Goldilocks zone of attachment and release, attuning our attention so as to promote hesitation without landing in indecision, and undissociated joy. Freedom involves the joy of integration, by which we lovingly and passionately pursue a project we find meaningful, and above all, one that meaningfully connects to all aspects of the person without starving any. The person as a whole is brought to bear on the current situation and is nourished by its devotion. The whole person is a multiplicity beyond what we can consciously be aware of all at once. The virtual multiplicity of memories that is infinite in its detail and which infinitely self-differentiates in diverse planes of consciousness. Each conscious state is a dissociated plane that contracts and integrates the whole past and whole person in a singular way. The attention to life attaches and fixes dissociation to optimize our practical advantage seeking. Intuition modulates dissociation and, in rare moments, bathes in the multiplicity of virtual reciprocal implication by means of voluntary, undissociated, open attention. Intuition is basically the contestation of the hypothesis that all attention is dissociative. Freedom is basically a cybernetics of dissociation, or techne, or spiritual technique, ascesis, in which we construct instruments to assist us in piloting, composing, and attuning the psyche. Since attention must regulate itself, its work is always through participation with itself, as agent and patient, student and teacher. You cannot look at dissociation. It is not an object, sensible impression, or even a pattern of movement. It is invisible, and only a being that is conscious of its duration and compares many moments of time, detached from the needs of the present moment, can become aware that its experience is the product of dissociations. Much like a transcendental structure, dissociation founds and operates in the coherence of experience transparently. It is the shake of the kaleidoscope, wherein the mind is completely distracted by the new image produced by the shake, and in which it never looks at the shake itself, how the mind attunes itself, how the image gets put together. Freedom as undissociated joy does not mean one stops dissociating, stops focusing their attention. Rather, it means they learn to balance the fugue state and automatisms with the release that cultivate a healthy blend of detachment, hesitation, and openness. The ethics is intended to interrupt and reorganize our patterns of dissociation, to coordinate a new set of attachments, and to train us to act in a way that will bring us undissociated joy. Hilaritas, cheerfulness, affects both the part and the whole of the body, does not pander to one part at the expense of the rest, in Part 4, Proposition 44 Scholium. The more the body is capable of perceiving and doing many things, the more its sensory motor system can do, the more capable it is of thinking, and thus of affirming more ideas. This is in Part 2, Proposition 14, Part 3, Proposition 11, and Part 4, Proposition 38. Our will is not infinite, but is exactly the size of our intellect, or in other words, according to Part 2, Proposition 49 Scholium, all the singular affirmations we come to understand gradually accumulates into virtue of mind, the power to act. The more we can affirm, the more we can act. We need a greater number of ideas, a diversity of ideas, not more general ideas, not greater abstractions, but more details and singular nuances. When we can disenthrall the mind of illusions and mutilated ideas and be more sensitive, we become freer to compose ourselves in ways that empower and sustain. Then, hilaritas and generosity combined, a collective and collaborative, undissociated joy is cultivated in a participatory virtue building, more precious than the knowledge production it makes possible. Again, as with Bergson, freedom and the work of philosophy are indistinguishable. Bergson's philosophy is fixed on the singular, transient becoming of duration, but his philosophical writings are far more speculative and descriptive, showing a commitment to depersonalizing and universalizing. As he wrote to William James, his friend and source of mutual inspiration, quote, "I believe in the mutability of reality rather than that of truth. If we could tune our faculty of intuition to the moving nature of the real, would not this tuning in itself be something stable? And truth, which can be nothing other than this tuning in itself, would also have something of the nature of this stability. End quote. The undissociated psyche is like the embryonic living matter before it forms itself in morphogenesis. The élan vital is the embryonic state of the whole universe, undissociated impersonal consciousness that splits, dédoublement, and dissociates into the immense diversity of life on our planet, each animal, to some extent, lost in the fugue state of its specialization. Freedom in the creative action does its best to preserve everything in the original élan that is not incompatible with the canalizations that have gotten it where it has landed in evolution. The intellect, and where it has ended by chasing pure space, has dissociated from the mobility and creativity of the original élan, completely represses the vitality and meaning of being alive, and sees only necessity and mechanism. Bergson goes so far as to make the idea of necessity into a kind of boogeyman that haunted the mythopoetic minds of the ancient Greeks, and philosophy had the task of consoling the trauma of confronting the violent, cruel necessity that even the gods cannot escape. Thus, philosophies of absolute necessity, from Epicurus to Lucretius to the Stoics and Spinoza, are intended to calm the mind of anxiety, ataraxia, by accepting a deterministic helplessness that is little more than a dissociation from the living evidence of our freedom. Nouwenhuis has gone quite far in connecting Pierre Genet's insights on dissociation to Spinoza and attempts to ground the psychotherapeutic account, his psychotherapeutic account, in a Spinozist framework. He, however, makes no mention of Bergson, although I don't imagine he would object to the vantage I am here presenting. Despite the conventionality of Bergson's reading of Spinoza as a pantheist who reduced God to nature and nature to mechanistic determinism, more people today affirm that Spinoza is closer to some sort of compatibilist concerning necessity and freedom, as Deleuze interpretation has it, to see freedom as the self-determining expression of an intensive individuation that becomes undissociated. This is conditioned on disenthralling the mind of the sources of delusion, both at the level of emotions and thoughts. Spinoza defined freedom narrowly at the beginning of the Ethics in definition 7 as what exists only from the necessity of its own nature and determined to action by itself alone. And in letter 58 to Tschirnhaus on freedom and necessity, Spinoza refers to free necessity and distinguishes it from compelled necessity. By the end of the Ethics, freedom proves to be the efficient, cautious, and perhaps even graceful execution of intelligent action made in concert with others, i.e., piety, intellectual generosity, and philosophy. When things don't completely work out as planned, and we still manage to eke out an outcome that we can live with, we are not completely free, but rather exert great effort to maintain what we have going. This is the condition of even the most virtuous, free, and blessed of all humans, certainly true of Spinoza himself, that freedom is always being impinged on, and that all he could do was do his best with what he had going, and with the aid of reason, he invented his way forward. But his freedom is not merely his own. It was possible because he lived in the Dutch Republic with its intellectual liberties, and his exposure to Cartesian philosophy by Franciscus van den Enden. He also shares his freedom with us in the ethics itself. Freedom is made to wait on the fulfillment of a host of anti-freedoms, hurdles, impediments, terms of resistance, and prohibitions thrown our way by material decay, societal pressure, institutional inertia, and misfortune. The more we work together, following reason, the more freedom we will be able to achieve in collaboration. Intellectual generosity takes this project as an imperative. We must liberate each other through our highest faculties. Until then, as per Spinoza's diagnosis, most people will be trapped in bondage to sad passions, patterns of antisocial behavior, and inadequate cognition that prevents our power from increasing and being guided by tranquility of mind. Philosophers and even virtuous folks will become harder to come by as sad passions, dissociative automatisms spread and evolve. Given the situation of our technology and industry, we require positive metaphysics and science to do work in greater coordination to stabilize and enrich our liberty as a moral, undissociated joy, blessedness. Bergson forces contingency back into the world in the slackening of our action, which hesitates, feels, observes, and recollects. He also describes God slightly more teleologically insofar as the élan vital involves a primordial yearning of love, not essentially different from agape, taken as integral to the necessity by which existence emerges, by which animal life progresses towards humans, and by which the mystic propels us forward morally. The mystic and the inventor make vivid to us the active manifestation of divine creativity. The free activity of Bergson is an expanded integration of multiplicities of memories, of states of consciousness, feelings, and sensations held in tension. Bergson calls it a, quote, fact of psychological observation that the will is indeed something amazing, something that, from certain angles, in certain aspects at least, partakes of the miraculous. The will is indeed a force capable of increasing indefinitely in itself. End quote. Consciousness has the power of indefinitely increasing its multiplicity of states, expanding into memories through associations, or into inexhaustible details of the sensible world. Just as emotion becomes more intense by involving more of our senses, smelling and tasting a lemon is more intense than merely seeing, and becomes more profound when it connects to an ever larger number of memories and feelings. So too, philosophically, we must become implicated in the larger context of our duration, beyond what consciousness is directly aware of at a given instance of dissociation. Bergson's view of the past and memory start to look eerily similar to the infinite intellect as exceeding consciousness. On March 31st, 1905, when Bergson turns to Spinoza in his College de France lectures on freedom, one might be surprised to find his presentation begins by positioning Spinoza's view as Aristotelian. Spinoza, he says, following Aristotle in the affirmation that philosophy is all about what we must love and how. Quote, what nourishes our soul with a joy without sadness and without mixture, an infinite, that is, the love of the eternal and infinite thing, as Spinoza says. This is exactly what Aristotle was telling us in Book 10 of the Nicomachean Ethics. Philosophy's goal is just this. It's, quote, so far as we can, making ourselves immortal. The word athanatizane is untranslatable. It means making immortality for oneself. Fabriquer de l'immortalité. We must make immortality for ourselves. This is exactly the object of philosophy such as Spinoza understands it. End quote. Following the tendency of Greek thought from Aristotle to Plotinus, Spinoza makes philosophy a transition from perishing finitude to superficial knowledge of accidents to the infinite, profound knowledge by which we manage to escape what passes away, what changes, to place ourselves back into eternity, as Bergson writes. Now, Bergson accepts that, in a sense, the whole problem of philosophy is about the aim of our love, that we attach ourselves to, and that we will insist on an effort or force, a Platonic conversion that turns us so that we love not the ephemeral or superficial, but the enduring and expanding dynamics of the will as a moral force. See example in Baroche, who traces the presence of Neoplatonic themes in Spinoza. Quote, "A natural force is something given not only in quantity, but even in magnitude. But a moral force, in a word, the force of willing, is something whose magnitude is not given, in the sense that with a little we can do a lot, or rather, there is neither a little nor a lot. We can will to will. We give ourselves willpower." End quote. It is due to the direction of the will that it becomes capable of transgressing the finite laws of mechanical causality. Direction refers to a non-localizable element, a sense, immanent to the sensible, while never appearing as one of the things present to the senses. In metaphysics, we must turn from the habits of the intellect towards those that align with the mystic and the inventor. Bergson continues this passage a little further down. Quote, "So there's something like an indefinite reservoir of energy, and of an energy, as it were, transformed into intellect. What's remarkable is that this power of the will is due above all to the direction. The force of nature are forces whose intensity isn't a function of their direction, doesn't depend on the direction we give them. But the force of the will comes to it from its direction. We could even define moral force insofar as it distinguishes itself from physical force in this way, a force whose intensity comes from its direction. If the will adopts a direction randomly, its force will be neutralized. There is one direction and only one, the direction we call the right direction, where, on the contrary, its force will multiply indefinitely. We have here a psychological truth that the ancients didn't perceive, or they perceived only vaguely, and that is what we call psychological intuition." End quote from Freedom Lectures. This direction for Spinoza is without a doubt the orientation towards God. The intellectual love of God leads to intuitive knowledge, which is our greatest joy and blessedness. But this orientation does not involve turning away from the world and transience, but of seeing God through the world, in particular, through singular things. Quote, "The more we understand singular things, the more we understand God." Ethics Part 5, Proposition 24. Bergsonians need not condemn Spinoza for his intellectualism or eternalism, so long as it does not overtake these other commitments in his philosophy, including the alignment with Bergson's openness, found also in Jean-Marie Goyot. Bergson painted Spinoza as a dissociative love that suppresses duration, rather than what it was, a love of generosity that kindles the productive tension of the metaphysically incongruent. Section 6. Goyot's Spinozist Spiritualism. The scarcely remembered French spiritualist prodigy Jean-Marie Goyot, who Bergson described as a brilliant disciple of Fouillé, provided something like a middle position between Spinoza and Bergson. And while bridging the moral political discussion from Spinoza to Bergson, it also provides a number of points of contrast. Bergson himself nodded in assent to Goyot's philosophical and moral insights. When Jankelevich assessed their intersection and divergence, this was in 1924, and Jankelevich made out that Goyot was exclusively a moralist, while Bergson's thought comprised neither a moral philosophy nor a religious philosophy. By the time of the two sources in 1932, Bergson affirms the moral bend of his intuitive philosophy as if it had been a constant, nearly unspoken assumption. Like Goyot, he sees the essential kernel of morality to be immanent to life, as Astesiano formulates, quote, "Moral fecundity brings fully to light the essence of life, which is first of all a force of expansion." End quote. And yet, following Weil, we know Bergson had in fact struggled more with writing this book out of all of his others, and only the experience of the war instituted a conviction in Bergson that he knew what he needed to write. It is based on the imminent joy of expanding and enriching power that morality blossoms. But it is in the face of abject violence and suffering that morality finds its sense. The essence of life is revealed not merely as the power to survive, but in generosity, which is a virtue we understand only by enacting it. Immorality is an impoverishment and stunting of life. Quote, "The violent man stifles the whole sympathetic and intellectual part of his being. By brutalizing others, he more or less brutalizes himself. Violence, which thus seemed to be victorious expansion of internal power, becomes in the end a restriction of this power. The despot becomes a child again. His objective omnipotence ends in bringing about a real subjective impotency." End quote. This maps to Spinoza's idea of bondage to passive, sad passions, vicious circles that keep us trapped as intensively diminished and unenriched. It also maps onto the cancerous habits of closed society that mutilate our heart, and above all, to the war instinct. Opposite to such sad passions that set us all at variance with one another are the collective empowerments of generosity. Quote, "There is a certain generosity which is inseparable from existence, and without which we die. We shrivel up internally. We must put forth blossoms. Morality, disinterestedness are the flowers of human life. Charity is but one with overflowing fecundity. The heart of the truly humane creature needs to be gentle and helpful to all. The richest life is found to be that which most tends to spend itself lavishly, to sacrifice itself within certain limits, to share itself with others." End quote from Guyot's Sketch of Morality. Bergson also made use of the spiritualist conception of generosity that Ravissant lifted from Descartes, making the true aim of education consist in the stimulation and enrichment of the spirit of generosity. Bergson did not engage directly with Guyot in the two sources, but one could track thematic connections between it and the Sketch of Morality independent of obligation and sanction, especially with respect to the renunciation of duty and the exaltation of a progressivist moral invention, morality as creative advance needed above all to propel the hearts and minds to devotion, passionate pursuits undertaken boldly in philosophical or empirical research. Bergson appears to think through and beyond Guyot's moralist, perhaps in directions Guyot himself would have undertaken had he lived longer. Taking the last two sections together, it appears that many key themes arranged around the ethics of generosity fall out from Deleuze philosophy, do not figure prominently in his creative projects, perhaps marking incompatible commitments separating Deleuze from these predecessors. Section 7, Conclusion. Quote, "That's why, however much we may have engaged through our personal reflections in paths different from Spinoza, we nevertheless become Spinocists once more, to a certain extent, each time we reread the Ethics, because we have the clear impression that such is exactly the altitude where philosophy must place itself. Such is the atmosphere in which the philosopher truly breathes." End quote. Bergson's letter to Brunswick, February 12, 1927. A degree of exaggeration is to be found in both Spinoza and Bergson. Spinoza exaggerated the power of reason and his rejection of teleology, which, as we saw, winds up only amounting to a limiting of the sense of finality to the concrete expression imminently patterning life and intellect. Conatus, generosity, blessedness, even reason, have their immanent sense, expanding all their energy, fulfilling the free action of their essence as the ever-renewed accomplishment temporalized by a minimally telic orientation. The gradual formation of Spinoza's geometrical philosophy is guided by its own immanent telos, first reared in the emendation of the intellect, which sets out with the goal of improving the formal reality of the mind, its operative, active intelligence. While Descartes set the stage by clearly stating the evidence of the formal reality of the mind, Spinoza radically renews the effort by overthrowing most of Descartes' expressed doctrines, that is, the role of the cogito, the indeterminacy of freedom. Spinoza exaggerates his own rejection of free will and contingency, evident in the fact that he finds it necessary to discuss the influence of contingency and utility on our behavior in Part 4, and even makes use of the free person as an exemplar or model we are meant to strive to emulate. The freedom that the civil state must preserve and promote in the final chapter of the theological political treatise forms a counter-exaggeration. Bergson exaggerated the difference between himself and Spinoza, as well as the core themes of his philosophy, such as instinct and knowledge in creative evolution, as he admits, or his attacks on habit, intellect, and linguistic expression, to which he opposed philosophical intuition and, in general, the traces of an anti-intellectualism which hardly anyone would deny entirely as a theme of Bergsonism, though not nearly as problematically as his analytic opponents would have it going back to Russell. His exaggerations have nevertheless won him a bad reputation, not unlike what Spinoza experienced after publishing the theological political treatise. Between Spinoza's hyper-rationalist theology and Bergson's sub-rational emotivism, there is a stance towards which various thoughts and ideas from each thinker can gravitate and coalesce, a position that is not anti but perhaps ana-rationalist, or better, an open rationalism that Deleuze himself gestures towards, but it seems to me, failed to fully stick up for. Guyot, and later figures like Whitehead, Merleau-Ponty, and Rillet are clear beneficiaries of such a middle stance on the power of reason. Deleuze rather seems to have dissociated from the model of freedom cast from intellectual generosity. He dissociates from the moral intuitions, distracted by escape to a Dionysian revel that I find incompatible with a more Apollonian spirit in Spinoza and Bergson. The dissociative joy of novelty, which takes no consideration for the organism as a whole or the ecosystem, and is even hostile to its proportioned unity. We must not overlook the risks that come with a careless, amoral, or adolescent Deleuzian freedom that exaggerates the value of novelty, a freedom to shock expectations through experimentation that plumbs chaos for pure novelty, where novelty is the only criteria. Schizophrenia becomes the model for an explosive freedom apparently incapable of intentionally forming and holding attachments. There is a problem of power or efficacy with this model of freedom, as well as a moral problem of criteria. Affects involve material flows of energy in unique compositions. The composition itself is an immanent idea, an ideality that is distinct to the multiplicity as a whole, or rather, assemblage. Deleuze steps down into the thrashing sea of Spinozan affects, and rather than following Spinoza's path to intellectual generosity and piety, suggests experimentation for its own sake. The only criteria are immanent to the event as the eternal return of difference, creativity without and beyond attachment. The title of freedom is pinned to the embryonic openness of a complete cessation of dissociation, deterritorialization. We risk fetishizing defiance and disobedience and fantasizing that we ourselves or others have freed themselves of all attachments. The effort to free ourselves from all attachments often leads to a dissociated fantasy that habits and customs are always bad, or that traditions are always bound to become a fascistic or cancerous tendency through nostalgia. Or, further, that everything we think and do is already captured by microfascisms, and that all power is oppressive. Deleuze seems to prescribe affects that require us to dissociate from the value of repetition and attachment. But for Spinoza, Only a being without affects is beyond good and evil. Insofar as we increase our power via active affects, we understand reason, piety, and generosity to be good. We maintain an attachment and form commitments. The war machine is a violent transformer of attachments, just as war forces people to compromise commitments, sacrifice their attachments in various ways, and the abolition of all attachments is rather cruel and injures or dissipates our power. We need to form certain attachments, commitments, maxims by which we conduct and devote our efforts. Deleuze takes the embryonic, undifferentiated body without organs as paradigmatic exemplar, while somewhat demonizing the organ and the organism as a cliché, a reiteration of formalism and repressive attachments. Far from attachments being deterministically fascist, it is rather more likely that promoting a fantasy of having no attachments promotes a nihilistic stance that acts as an affordance to political exploitations that do real harm, whether fascist, capitalist, technocratic, socialist, or democratic. It weakens one's ability to compose their affects effectively. Deleuze himself, in his life, research, and teaching, held more commitments than the standard of mere experimental novelty. An adolescent Deleuzean freedom dissociates from the fact that we must actively strive, using intelligence, actively modulating our dissociations in order to continue to harbor the embryonic potential for differentiation. This stance is antithetical to Deleuze's project as I see it, and he should have done more to prevent it from arising. Deleuze himself is not the adolescent Deleuzean I'm criticizing. Just as we must protect our brain from injury, so too we must protect our psyche from the violence of the war instinct, and Deleuze should have protected his philosophy from this danger. Novelty is the very fact of every moment of existence, according to both Bergson and Deleuze. Thus, it is only when novelty affords us affects that are sustainable and renewable, when the new composition increases our power, that it could become a standard worthy of commitment, a goal of becoming. We must maintain an organized body, a sensory motor system, that orchestrates our affects if we are to preserve the embryonic power of our freedom. I think Deleuze is aware of this, but the body without organs is more fragile than Deleuze lets on, and is more dependent on the organism and reason if it is to have any value and not be a dangerous coercive force of disintegration beyond what we can survive. Like giving someone a firearm without teaching them how to use it, or impressing them with the sense that if they turn it against another, they will regret it forever or risk being consumed by the war instinct. For Spinoza, the value of appetitive attachments manifests irrefutable evidence in certain ideas. One human relates to another as a god. Two working together in fellowship are more powerful than three working alone. Only love can conquer hate. The virtuous person desires others to have virtue. And only what contributes to understanding is certainly known to be good. The whole idea is to pattern and organize our affects and attachments, and attach them to the contentment of spirit that arises from living by these ideas, attaching them to as many of our ideas as we can, opening them to an undissociated connection with all corners of the psyche and the cosmos. For Bergson, it is a moral intuition that transforms our understanding and our way of being, while nevertheless resisting translation to words through description, explanation, and conceptualization. Ultimately, it is our concrete life that we experience situations that irreversibly change our perspective and orientation. Philosophers must make an effort to have undissociated joy, which openly relates to all of our experiences and commitments, that promotes and empowers our whole self and all the members of our body and community. We find a vivid example of the moral intuition in Bergson's own life in his experience of the Great War, its horrors, and its effects on people's psyches, as well as his own. It impressed a moral sense on him. It is instituting a commitment and provided him with what he needed to research the two sources. At first, the news of the war caused him to dissociate and fantasize, an involuntary reaction that lessens the blow, protects one from absolute depression. Later, after the horrors of the war have been experienced, the undissociated intuition arose that enveloped his whole life. The intuition is irrevocable and institutes a criteria for free action. One will always pass judgment on their own performance in life and seek what promotes and avoid what hinders the prolongation, deepening, and intensifying and enriching of that intuition. It creates a vocation. The intuition is an adequate idea that, by harmonizing the formal and objective reality of the mind, acts by expressing itself immediately from its essence as an efficient cause. Through its own power, it increases its power endogenously. Only mystical intuition can expand our consciousness to the size of our technology, our automata, before they destroy us. Bergson and Vail recounts, was haunted by the intuition that emerged from the war. It changed his account of human nature and shifted the focus of his optimism, perhaps because he stopped dissociating from the numerous sources of pessimism he could have already found well before the war. Spirit accomplishes its own autogenesis without the extraction and consumption required in constructing using scarce resources. It is sublime and consoling. We can light one another's candles without starving our own flame. The fact that we can imagine a world in which what Lincoln called the tyrannical principle and Bergson's war instinct does not dominate. We are filled with an assurance that our efforts can bring about positive change in the world. The practical postulate is rather the existence of affordances rather than the freedom. A spiritual energy of moral life bridges a congenial mixing of Bergsonian and Spinozan themes, even if they each exaggerate the nature of spirit in opposite directions, towards geometry or poetry. Only through an investigation of attunement and dissociation can we formulate a viable alternative to the concepts that have framed history's compatibilisms. Astesiano concluded that Bergson is neither Spinoza nor the other of Spinoza, but represents a possibility opened by his philosophy, centering on affects of joy, devotion, and philosophical generosity. Here we find what we can call a philosophy of the open, while remaining aware of the different consequences of each effort to enact a philosophy of the open, a philosophy that opens. His work also stirs up more general questions for philosophers today. Moving forward, how can we present a past philosopher accurately in scholarship, in the classroom, in popular contexts, while at the same time generatively? By generative, I mean the living and integral intelligence enveloping aesthetic, moral, abstract, concrete ingredients, which involves all these divergent tendencies in a state of reciprocal implication, a virtual and self-differentiating multiplicity, prior to dissociation. Treating a philosopher generatively means making their texts and ideas not only accessible, but also fruitful to contemporary philosophical thinking, involving some lifting, going through and beyond, transgression, etc., as well as to re-enliven the very intuition that led our predecessors to philosophizing, the pressure that cracks the edifice, and eventually to say, construct, adopt, and perhaps even to exaggerate in order to effectively communicate these insights in a way that is not merely communicating information, but empowering. To philosophize is to take up the problems themselves for oneself in their time and community, as Deleuze and Bergson both say. We must teach with both the abstract simplification, by which we would externalize all philosophical systems to each other, and peruse them in reflection as if all could be looked at in a glance. We need imagination, reason, and intuition working in collaboration without reducing or sacrificing them to each other. Here we will likely attempt to imagine a future intellect that has inspected all the texts, systems, and ideas, and passed a final judgment on what to keep from them all and what has crumbled under its own inadequacy. But we cannot hope to do anything like this, other than in an entirely inadequate and provisional way, and only in a concerted effort in scholarly community can we hope to make any meaningful headway. In this endeavor, Deleuze has been among the most helpful and productive, and I am forever grateful for his immense contributions. As philosophers, we must, from time to time, devote our attention in different directions with varying degrees of narrowness, now dissociating from Deleuze to think about Spinoza in his own terms, and now on to Bergson, then to both of them together, and etc., and even from one set of topics to another as we move from one text to another in a single philosopher's corpus. We cannot hope to do this well without appropriately dissociating. We must devote time to the integration of these diverse planes to form integrals of experience. But this also involves its own dissociation, since it suppresses the singular fugue state in which we develop intensive variations in a stream of consciousness. By canalization or narrowing, consciousness enriches both its object and itself in a reciprocal resonance. Both an undissociated open awareness and a narrowing by dissociative canalization are necessary in philosophy, but we cannot do both at the same time, and we risk over-favoring one or the other. We must not only experiment, but need to form an attachment to make the experiments useful. We seek to compose ourselves so that freedom is sustainable, so that we can harbor and expand our embryonic potential while propagating active affects. These two commitments must both be satisfied by its own standard while not letting either disrupt the other. Spinoza would not even say we are free to make ourselves unhappy. Freedom is entirely dependent on the necessary causal influence that virtue actually achieves the best possible life for us. We are rather bound by emotions that assail us, but are not explained through our nature. Just as the act of hitting is a virtue considered solely in view of its power to act, but also as a vice and weakness when contextualized in the emotions of hatred and anger. Thus, freedom is an undissociated joy of composing affects that are sustainable, regenerative, and shareable. We must each develop what I call a cybernetics of dissociation, learning how to regulate, manage, and pilot our dissociations, what distracts or catches our attention, how to integrate both the closure of dissociations and canalizations with the undissociated openness that can reroute the whole river or find a new game to play. The formal reality, the attunement, cannot merely become an object of study, but implicitly demands a new formation of attunement. The fact is that we must do many things in philosophy and should not become automated, fixated on one way of thinking or writing. Give due to both the concrete and the abstract, to be intuitive to the point of mysticism, and also be disciplined and rational. The ethics is a mix of different forms of discourse, not exclusively elements in geometrical order. It's the voice of the scholia, preface, and appendices in which Spinoza's own purpose is shown, his polemics and his generosity are enacted. Ultimately, Spinoza advocates for the health of the individual and the community by teaching us to strive for what affects us with joy and affects the whole of the body and mind equally and preserves the proportion among the relation of the parts, hilaritas. We must feed our appetites in a way that lets them hang together in harmony. There is a wholeness possible in community, so that the more our affects augment rather than diminish each other, the more powerful we all become. As in the body, so in philosophy, we must not let our imagination or reason choke out intuition. There is an undissociated joy that arises when all of our powers are able to work in concert. Bergson says as much with respect to the whole person. We are free to the extent that we gather ourselves up and make our whole person, our whole past, bear on the act of creating a novel formation. Thus, philosophy itself takes shape within the incompatibility of two necessary but divergent commitments, a faithfulness both to the past and to the future, both to accuracy and to the creative use that goes through and beyond singular formations. It is from the image of this productive tension, found in many diverse expressions, in our struggle to exist and perfect ourselves and each other, being at once eternal, temporal, and enduring, determining and determined, virtual and actual, focused and distracted. It is the very oscillation between such incompatibilities that engenders one's conviction in the reality of freedom.